Thank you all very much for coming at such an early hour this morning, and I apologize in advance for my voice. But this discussion is going to be on impacts of the Israeli election and the still ongoing, but dare I say, likely to succeed process of coalition formation under Prime Minister designate Bibi Netanyahu. Our two principal speakers today, Khalil Shikaki, Gilead Sher, are well placed to lead in this discussion. Khalil is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah. He has also been a Senior Fellow at Brandeis University. He got his doctorate from Columbia University and has taught and worked with many American diplomats, both in Palestine, in Israel, as well as in Washington. And he is an old associate of mine from many decades back. Gilead Sher is the Isaac and Mildred Brockstein Fellow in Middle East Peace and Security here at the Baker Institute, a position in honor of Yitzhak Rabin. He was Chief of Staff and Policy Coordinator to former Israeli Prime Minister and Minister of Defense Ehud Barak, and was a senior negotiator with the Palestinians at the final Camp David Summit and the Taba talks in 1999 to 2000, one of the last wholly successful negotiations between Israel and one of its Arab neighbors prior to the conclusion of the Abraham Accords. Both of these individuals will speak, giving their thoughts on the implications, not so much of the elections, but rather of the character of the government being formed and what it means for Palestinians, what it means for Israelis, what it means for the region. I will then ask some pointed questions of both, and then we will open it up for your questions. But with that said, let me turn first to Gilead and then to Khalil.
Thank you very much, David, and good morning to all of you. I'll briefly cover three perspectives in my remarks: Israeli politics, the civil society, and foreign policy. In 5 days, Netanyahu will have to ask for an extension of 2 more weeks to establish his government, one that in all likelihood will hammer down a dramatically different Israel, more Jewish, nationalistic, less democratic. The incoming leadership will be the most religious, ultra-right, fanatic, anti-liberal, ultra-conservative, and racist ever. In addition, it comprises an unprecedented number of future ministers who are corrupt, indicted, formally arrested, and criminally convicted. All of them are oblivious to the rule of law and the separation of governance powers. Israeli elections on November 1st marked the end of the common division between left and right. Evidently, Zionist center-left requires reframing, reestablishing, and regrouping. And the struggle now is between liberal, progressive, and democratic citizens and the ones that are hardcore conservatives, messianic, nationalistic. The political expression of the difference between the two blocs was only some 3,000 votes. And from a societal perspective, months after the elections, domestic schisms are deepening every day. Secular versus religious, Arabs versus Jews, lower socioeconomic classes versus upper ones, and of course, settlers versus non-settlers. Controversies are boiling over Israel's character as a democratic nation state of the Jewish people and the rule of law. Netanyahu's upcoming government is openly committed by proxies to further weaken both fundamental values and established state institutions, while systemically campaigning to crush the judiciary. And this brings to mind what is often mentioned here, January 6th. The civil society in Israel feels that there is a rapid sellout of the democratic foundations of the country. Our quasi-constitutional Bill of Rights, the 1948 Declaration of Independence, is being constantly marginalized. And some commentators would say that the initial epicenter of all this is Netanyahu's will to escape from his ongoing criminal trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. They are not necessarily wrong. The menu has myriad dishes, curbing and changing laws, weakening the Supreme Court, sterilizing law enforcement bodies, chasing civil societies, NGOs, and so on. So now civil society rises against the subjugation of the country to the personal concerns of just one person, Prime Minister designated Netanyahu. So now if you add to my descriptions a proliferation of fake news, conspiracy theories, and truth decay, you understand that the internal clash between the blocs is perhaps not imminent, but most probably unavoidable. Moving on to the Israeli-Palestinian arena, it is unlikely that any dialogue would be resumed under the next government. Politically, on both sides, there is neither will nor feasibility, and the intermittent conflict hardens attitude and exacerbates the narratives. There is a rapidly growing sense that the two states for two people paradigm is lost. I'm sure that you will hear about that in a few minutes from Khalil. But nevertheless, I venture to argue that advancing resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should remain high priority on the Western world agenda. The status quo offers neither security nor stability for the region, let alone hope. And with the potentially incoming government, we face a de facto annexation of the West Bank. The settlers movement now has the Israeli border police in the West Bank under Ben-Gvir, Meir Kahana's racist successor. In addition, Israel's civil administration in the territories, as well as the government's coordinator there, were granted to Smotrich, an extremist protagonist of settlement expansion. The US administration is likely to collide with the new government sooner rather than later. Nevertheless, if the US believes that only a two-state for two people reality in the absence of an agreement is indispensable even more nowadays, it should maintain the conditions for it. How? If I have the time, I'll elaborate now. If not, let's discuss it in the Q&A part. David.
Thank you very much, Gilad. Khalil, fadal.
Thank you, Dave. A pleasure to be with you. It goes without saying that the mood here in Ramallah is very depressed. It goes without saying that the Palestinian Authority expects the worst. And this comes at a time when this Palestinian Authority is weaker than it has been in many, many years. It has lost its legitimacy among the Palestinians. There is a great deal, in fact, almost a vast majority of the Palestinian public that rejects the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, credibility of the Palestinian Authority, on both, and disagrees with the Palestinian Authority's policies, both on the domestic side of things and on Israeli-Palestinian issues. So this comes at that moment in which the capacity of the Palestinian Authority to be able to maintain control and stability, and of course, put a stop to some of the violence that has been taking place throughout this year, is very, very limited. And that makes the changes that are about to take place we just heard from Gilead, really something that the Palestinian Authority have to be very, very much concerned about. I agree with Gilead that we do not have right now any path for ending the conditions of the status quo. There's no path to a permanent peace, to a two-state solution right now, and this is definitely not going to change. It will change to the worst. The reality on the ground of one state reality is obviously going to be consolidated, and it will be consolidated in significant ways, not perhaps just de facto ways, given the changes that we have just heard from Gilead in terms of who will control the civil administration and who will control the office of the coordinator. These are the two agencies that are responsible to a great extent on determining the fate of the Palestinians who live in the West Bank. But there are other things. Of course, things can get much worse than they are right now. And the question is whether they will, and how fast they will, conditions will worsen. I would say we have things that have been instituted during the last year and a half. For the last 18 months, we have seen some discussion going on between Palestinians and Israelis, meetings between senior officials and so on. I don't see any of this continuing with the new Israeli government. The new policy that the current Defense Minister Gantz has instituted, which allowed for some confidence-building measures to be taken, and allowed some positive environment to prevail to some extent. It did not in any significant way change the trajectory of things. The Palestinian Authority is becoming weaker and weaker. The vacuum that it is creating in the West Bank is becoming bigger and bigger. This, of course, creates a great deal of conditions that allow armed groups to emerge, to arm and to engage in violent attacks. These attacks so far this year have tripled so far compared to last year, and I can definitely see that continuing in the future with the new Israeli government. So the efforts to strengthen the Palestinian Authority will probably stop, and similar with regard to the policy in Gaza. This new government that have lasted for about 18 months came right after the war of May of last year. And the policy regarding Hamas was one that essentially wanted to engage Hamas by giving Hamas a reason not to get involved in conflicts that involve the West Bank and Israel. And if you probably ask those in Israel, in the security sector, they will probably tell you they think this policy has worked. Will this policy continue? Will the new Netanyahu and his government continue with Gaza, the same policy that we have seen during the last 18 months? Again, I doubt that very much. But that then brings into the violence that I anticipate will increase significantly in the West Bank, a great deal of violence also involving Hamas and Israel. What areas will this affect? Well, it depends on what policy changes Netanyahu and his new government will bring about. We have those areas where we have the greatest concern, of course, are the holy places. We don't know exactly how the status quo will change. I personally have absolutely no doubt that the status quo will change. The question is how de jure this change will be, how fast it will come, how widespread it will be. But certainly this is one area. Similarly, as Gilead said, the issue of the de facto annexation will continue. And I, in fact, worry more about that de facto annexation becoming qualitatively different if it involves some new and major settlements that the state of Israel has so far refrained from starting. What happens with the East Jerusalemites, the residents in Sheikh Jarrah, for example, and the legal status of settlements and settlers. The issue of the financial situation with regard to the Palestinian Authority. The state of Israel today deducts about $50 million every month in punishment for the Palestinian Authority. This means the capacity of the Palestinian Authority to even pay salaries is reduced. In the last year, it has been able to pay only 80% of the salaries. So for all these issues, we will have flashes, areas of conflict and there will be significant implications that will involve those Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. And I think the most important will affect the holy places, will affect the territory, the land issue, and will affect the institution of the Palestinian Authority. On the holy places, I can see the rising tension in Jerusalem, leading to armed conflict with Hamas, to adverse relations with the PA, certainly leading to a weaker PA. And it could also worsen relations with Jordan, perhaps even with some other Arab countries at the regional level, if holy places are indeed, if conditions in holy places are to be changed in a manner, particularly if this change is de jure, that is an actual change in policy. Similarly, with the question of land, the issue of annexation, the accelerated expansion of settlements, which essentially, for example, if you just legalize the dozens of outposts that are currently throughout the West Bank, they become settlements. You almost double the number of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. That certainly destroys any discussion about a two-state solution in the future. And this one-state reality that we currently see will obviously be consolidated, and we'll stop discussing a two-state solution and begin to talk about what to do with this one-state reality and how do we transform it into a one-state solution, with Israelis, of course, completely rejecting that, and greater evidence of support for this among the Palestinians. It will also accelerate the campaign to internationalize the conflict with the ICJ and ICC and so on. The idea that what we have in the West Bank is a system of apartheid will give the BDS movement the capacity to show with evidence that Israel is moving in this direction. And as I said earlier, the weaker, that is about the institution, which is the PA, the weaker the PA, the greater the vacuum that will be left behind in the West Bank, the greater perhaps the level of violence as a result of greater organization and arming that will take place. Something, as I said, that we have seen throughout this year. And the potential, of course, for another sort of intifada that would be very destructive to both Israelis and Palestinians become something that is in fact likely. Thank you.
I've got leadership questions for you both. First, for Gilad. This is a very curious coalition being put together from the perspective of Prime Minister-designate Netanyahu. He is intrinsically conservative, secular. He regards the settlers, particularly the more radical settlers, as disruptive to his own political objectives. They are problems. They are not individuals or movements which he strongly supports. Yet he has a government which, as you pointed out, I was tempted to say, tell us how you really think, is problematic from these perspectives. So here's my question. I would assume one of the objectives of individuals like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich is to catch Bibi in a situation in which he is compelled to authenticate, to legitimize their activities, to bring them in from the excluded extreme. But all of that jeopardizes Netanyahu's own position. If there is indeed a further surge in conflict, the wave attacks Khalil referred to, coming now with increasing frequency from the West Bank, if, more significantly, there is an attempt to provoke Hamas or to stop the policy now some years in existence of essentially incentivizing Hamas or disincentivizing them from conflict by basically paying them off. If that changes, this threatens him. So here's my question. The ultimate bargain for the Prime Minister, is it political power and endurance in office, or is it relief either by law or a deal from his legal problems?
The latter one. Netanyahu is concerned with only one issue, and it has been so for the last at least 5 years. He will stop at nothing, absolutely nothing. It's not the old Netanyahu that you have known, and we will all have known until, let's say, 2015. After that, Netanyahu has changed. He will stop at nothing. He will legitimize the illegitimate. He will apply force when needed, but he will yield his leverage to those who could do that for him as proxies. Now, in order to change the laws, in order to weaken the Supreme Court, in order to demolish the law enforcement bodies, including the state prosecutor and the attorney general, Netanyahu will allow Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Shas and the ultra-Orthodox to have whatever they wish in order to preserve the keys for his release from court, from his criminal charges, and very, very possibly from eventually going to jail. Now, you spoke about an upsurge of violence, which I anticipate as well. And violence, is always responded by violence as well. And there's a vicious circle, a bloody vicious circle of Palestinian terrorism and violence from both Gaza and the West Bank, retaliation by Israel, and so on and so forth. But the fascism that we now witness, like a growing trend in Israel, was always attracted by the application of force and by the application of more force if needed. And I believe that, people tend to forget that military power alone do not resolve anything, and that violence does not resolve anything, and that there's no way to even to subside violence without a shared horizon of some political settlement. And if this is the part that is missing, and that will be missed throughout the term that I expect this government to have, then we will see a deterioration at an accelerated pace towards more violence and less hope, and of course a deterioration on a slippery slope towards the one state disastrous outcome. It's not a solution, of course. It's just an outcome of doing nothing to prevent it from being the reality. And why do I say that it is disastrous? Because for Israel, it is the end of the Zionist enterprise of democratic nation state of the Jewish people in Eretz Israel. And for the Palestinians, it's the end of their aspirations for sovereignty and statehood and self-determination in a land of their own. This is the one state, the binational state, which will be in a constant civil war from the moment it becomes a reality. So I'm prudently optimistic that perhaps the United States administration or other international actors will prevent that, or will at least attempt to find a way to prevent that. I'm less optimistic when I'm looking at the composition of the upcoming government and upcoming coalition, and the trends within the Palestinian public that Khalil has mentioned.
Khalil, If tonight Abbas were to pass, what would be the consequence, if any, on the character of Palestinian leadership, unity of leadership, and the present challenges?
We have absolutely no idea what happens if Abbas disappears suddenly. Because Abbas, during the last few years, have essentially destroyed the institutional mechanism that has been in place that would have allowed us to predict what would happen the day after Abbas. Right now, we're not able to predict it. We can only make guesses. And those guesses, right now, in a survey, we've just asked the public about this. What do you expect will happen the day immediately after Abbas? Half of the Palestinian public said there will be significant internal violence between the various factions within Fatah and between Fatah and Hamas throughout the West Bank. This is indeed the nightmare scenario that a lot of Palestinians are worried about. However, let's be a little bit optimistic. Let's say that, in fact, we do find some rational thinking, and that internal violence within Fatah will not take place, and that Fatah and Hamas will indeed, in fact, sit down and try to come up with an alternative to violence and perhaps go to elections. Would Fatah be able to put its act together, and would Fatah and Hamas agree on a substitute for a temporary substitute for Abbas? I think that in that scenario, the answer is yes, they probably can. And Fatah will be able to find someone within its ranks. As a political party, Fatah does have its own rules. Although, again, even those rules, Abbas has, in the last 2 years or so, has complicated the picture significantly for us to be able to look at this situation and make educated guesses as to what is likely to happen. We currently see 4 or 5 leaders within Fatah who will, in fact, be vying for power, and the rivalry. We have absolutely no idea how it will end. But assuming that this rivalry will come under control, then we have people right now that Abbas wishes will succeed him, who will be very much similar to Abbas. But those who are challenging them are people who are not necessarily similar to Abbas. And if we leave it up to the public to decide, they will be decidedly different than Abbas. So these are 3 scenarios, and you can pick the one you like. If we go to elections, the person who is most likely to be elected by the public from Fatah, because he is the single most popular Palestinian leader today, is Marwan Barghouthi, who is a terrorist for the Israelis, a national hero for the Palestinians. He's the single most popular Palestinian leader today. He can win elections by 2/3 majority, and he can run while he is in jail in Israel. His policies are much similar to Arafat's policies rather than to Abbas's policies. And certainly, Israeli-Palestinian relations will be influenced significantly by if we indeed end up voting and bringing Marwan Barghouthi as a leader, which, as I said, is almost definitely the outcome of elections if he decides to run, which most likely he will do. If it is an agreement, a de facto agreement without going to elections, would Fatah and Hamas be able to agree, or would Fatah itself be able to agree on someone to replace Abbas? Highly unlikely, but I will not rule that out. It is possible that someone will be selected as temporary leader. We do have a deputy head of Fatah who has not shown so far leadership qualities. He is not known at the national level. He is still a local leader rather than a national leader. There are some national leaders, but they will have very stiff resistance within Fatah that might prevent them from becoming the number 1 within that political party. Leaving things as they are without violence, but also without an agreement, means essentially the current prime minister and the heads of the security services, all of them from Fatah in the West Bank, will essentially find a mechanism in which they can coordinate policies together and can coordinate with the Israelis, assuming there is an Israel that is interested in coordinating at a reasonable level, rather than weaken and destroy the Palestinian Authority, then the Prime Minister can do that. So in this case, the Prime Minister becomes the top most important individual. But as I said earlier, that will certainly create a great deal of animosity and rivalry within Fatah, because he is certainly not seen as the number 2 right now. And if he becomes the number 1 on de facto basis, that certainly will generate a great deal of realignment within Fatah with people wanting to bring him down. So I'm afraid, Dave, I did not give you a very clear answer, but I hope I've shown you how complex this situation is today.
Nothing is clear. I have one final question for you both, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. A few days ago, 2 dear friends of all of ours, Dan Kurtzer and Aaron Miller, published an editorial which has received wide commentary, in which they, using rather directive language, spoke of the U.S. imperative to exert influence and pressure upon Israel to resume a peace process. I will offer an editorial comment of my own. I have rarely, since 1993, seen such attempts yield a significant or lasting positive effect when it is running counter to the center of Israeli political thought, whether that is wise or not, strategic or not, in Israel's, quote, interests, close quote, or not. It is the reality we face. But I will ask both of you, and if I could ask you to be short in your comments, what exactly could the United States do that would have anything other than a negative impact on policy at this moment? Gilad?
You know, David, we always say that the United States cannot want a process more than the parties, the respective parties want. And that is a cliche, but it is true. What could the United States do? I'll tell you what they can do. They could work throughout public diplomacy with ultimate game changer, not necessarily the governments, but the youth, the civil societies, the social networks. They could use cross-border issues of common concerns as springboards to the Israeli-Palestinian context, the climate change, environment, technology, counterterrorism, healthcare, whatever. They can work diligently with partners in the region, namely Egypt, to politically reconcile Hamas and Fatah. And I've heard some hints from Khalil about such an eventuality someday. They could engage with the Arab world, what they already do, both the State Department and the White House. Discard the exclusive bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiation framework, or even dialogue, by adding regional talks and discussions, and thus creating kind of a Western Sunni axis. They can use the Arab Peace Initiative as a general ballpark. They can broaden up the existing agreement that you've mentioned, such as, you know, the 2020 Abraham Accords. And, you know, just to finish a very brief telegraphic presentation here of what could the United States do, I think that they should lower the bar of expectations to a more modest but achievable level. They should introduce a graduality in the process and replace the old formula of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, looking for a full-fledged comprehensive agreement. Whatever is agreed or coordinated should be implemented, and they can encourage, even incentivize the two sides to take constructive steps independently towards disengaging from one another, because it is a divorce that we are looking for, not a wedding, and preserve the conditions that would allow eventually to create a reality of two states on the ground instead of the outcome that we spoke about earlier on.
Thanks, Gilad. Khalil?
Well, I appreciate very much what Dan and Aaron have said. I doubt very much that there is an administration in Washington right now that is willing to listen to that. So, however, if I do have a sort of the ability to make any suggestions, I would say first and foremost to strengthen the Palestinian Authority. This is going to be the easiest thing to do, although even that I doubt very much that the administration will be able to do. But strengthening the Palestinian Authority is not just strength in security capacities or economic capacity, but legitimacy first and foremost. That means going to elections. Without elections, this Palestinian Authority is doomed to collapse eventually, sooner or later, and this new Israeli government will make it sooner rather than later. If the administration values the two-state solution, it needs this Palestinian Authority to continue to exist and to be stronger with greater legitimacy. This should be goal number one for the administration. Goal number two is to preserve the two-state solution. That is going to be tougher to do for the administration than the first one, but essentially means provide Israel with red lines as to what the administration will or will not tolerate, and what kind of leverage it believes it has, to make that clear that there will be consequences for crossing these red lines with regard to new settlements, changing the legal status of settlers or settlements in the West Bank, and so on and so forth. That is something that the administration, I hope, would be considering. Again, while I think the administration will make clear that it is opposed to all of this, the administration, however, without leverage, is not going to get anywhere with the new Israeli government. And thirdly, and that is going to be the toughest thing to do, is to move the position of the administration, that this position it has taken during the last 2 years, that it will not restore a diplomatic process between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The administration should be ambitious with this regard, and it will be essential to bring some sort of diplomatic process underway if the relationship between the two sides is not to deteriorate further beyond where it has gone, both in terms of the violence, but also in terms of the internationalization of the conflict going to the ICC and ICJ and so on. All of this will continue and will expand without a diplomatic process underway. These would be the three packages, in my view, that the administration should be focused on. And I would certainly begin with the first one because it's the easiest for the administration to do. But yet again, I must say that I have very little trust that the administration has the political will to do what I've just said, or to do what Dan and Aaron have said.
Thank you. To the audience.
Mr. Satterfield, your predecessor put together a very interesting working group very quietly and very privately for a number of years in order to try to come up with some solutions to these complex problems. Is that an area that you intend to continue to foster within your overall activities?
I will respond, even though I am no longer a government diplomat in a diplomatic fashion. The resources of the Institute will always be applied to processes and structures that have a real-world potential to have a real-world impact. This is an enormously complex issue. If it were subject to track 2.5, track 1.5 style negotiations, pleasant as they are for the participants, and interesting though their venues may be, they have produced very, very little over many, many years.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador, do you think that if these policies implemented by the new Netanyahu government will create schisms within the American Jewish community in their support of Israel, and at the same time strengthen the evangelical community? Do you see a major or possible split in American support for Israel, and how would you view that as far as the political reality of that split?
Over the last half century, I have come to learn several basic truths, one of which is don't purport to speak for, quote, the American Jewish community, close quote. The community is highly diverse, quite complex, reflects differently upon different issues, has many different priorities, some of which are almost wholly divorced from foreign affairs or even Israel itself. So I would only draw attention to the comments that the various spokespersons for the community make themselves. I can't offer any kind of gloss on that. But I will say one thing. I do believe that there is a fundamental, enduring identification with Israel. One can say that is justified at times, unjustified at times, partly justified at times, but it is real. And I frankly do not see that changing at the level of government policy, legislative branch, executive branch, at any time in the near future.
In the United States, left means almost communism. I'd like these gentlemen to please describe what left and right means and for the groups that they're representing.
Sure. Gilead?
I didn't hear the question. Can you repeat it, please?
In Israeli political terms, Palestinian political terms, what do left and right mean?
What do left and right mean? That's not a question for the last 10 minutes of a session, but I will tell you. I will try to explain that by telling you the following. Have you heard about the kibbutzim in Israel? Those communities, those collective communities that the majority of which were for decades left or centrist left at the most. But most of them were identified with the Labour Party, with Ben-Gurion and Tabenkin and other heads of state. Nevertheless, in the last election, in the last election round, we have 255 kibbutzim, the vast majority of which, as I said, are left and centrist left. All but 5 had some members who voted for Ben-Gvir, who is Kahana's successor, who follows his racist steps. I think that it gives you an idea of what is left from the left in Israel. And it requires a reshuffling from scratch, which is something that I'm prudently optimistic about in light of the trends within the civil society currently.
Khalil?
Well, the term right is not used in the Palestinian discourse. Instead, we use Islamism to refer to those conservative right-wing elements in Palestinian society and politics. And the left are basically those who share views that tended to be Marxist and communist in the past, and they tend to be a small minority. And in the center, we have secular nationalists like Fatah, the ruling party in the West Bank today. So the distinction would therefore be between those who call for an Islamic state in Palestinian politics, who reject the state of Israel and a two-state solution, and between those who support it, which would be the mainstream secular nationalists as well as the left. But the left on our side, unlike the left in Israel, which tend to be more dovish, more moderate and willing to make peace with the Palestinians, our left, while also willing to make peace with the Israelis, tend to be more hardline and to be more hawkish than the mainstream secular nationalist Fatah. So if the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian relations is at stake, it is the mainstream secular nationalist Fatah that represents the backbone of the peacemakers for any peacemaking in the future.
Thank you. Yes.
For Gilad, assuming the coalition is formed, what does he perceive to be Netanyahu's relationship with Putin and Lavrov in light of the significant movement of military equipment from Syria to the Ukraine and Iran's military assistance to Russia?
Traditionally, Netanyahu considered himself as a friend of Putin. He did not criticize the last year's violent actions and offensive of Putin in Ukraine until this very moment. I believe that he will be more reluctant to convey any kind of messages of support to Putin currently. But we needed this kind of relationship in order to coordinate our Air Force actions in Syria and the countering of all kinds of Iranian precision weaponry that was shipped to Syria. So we needed an operative level of coordination, and Netanyahu did it quite skillfully with Putin, but nothing more than that. And I truly hope that we do not return to the era in which he would brag about his friendship with Putin anymore.
Let me and offer an even blunter remark. For the Gulf states in the Arab world, for Israel, the prime, immediate, and strategic longer-term challenge is not Russia or the consequences of Russian success if it were to come in Ukraine. It's Iran. And Iran's presence, Iran's terrorist and conventional military expansion, its hegemonistic ambitions. Russia has, to put it mildly, acquiesced, if not derived a degree of strategic satisfaction in Israel's military operations to constrain, to cut the grass, as the expression goes, of Iranian ambitions in Syria. Were Russia to cease that acquiescence and directly challenge Israeli activities overhead in Syria, that would pose a major strategic challenge to what is the major strategic threat to Israel today. This is a tough, tough situation for Israel to divide between, just as it is for the Arab states, because Russia, whatever we, others may think, isn't their primary threat. Another state is. All the way in the back.
Yeah, based on the reality that the two states is becoming more and more of a fantasy, based on the analysis, should the populations, particularly the Palestinians, prudently prepare themselves for what you're calling endless civil war?
I refer that to our speakers.
Well, if by civil war you mean civil war between Palestinians and Israelis, the answer is, well, we will continue to see violence as the one-state reality is consolidated. You can see today, look at the figures between this year and last year. The number of settler attacks on Palestinians, the year has not ended yet, but the number of settler attacks on Palestinians have more than doubled already. And the number of Palestinian violent armed attacks, shooting attacks on Israeli military and settlers in the West Bank has tripled. That is something that certainly is going to continue in the foreseeable future, as long as the Palestinian Authority continues to be weakened by its own behavior and by the behavior of the State of Israel. So, and of course, that takes us further and further away from the two-state solution, and people begin to think in terms of a two-state outcome, a one-state outcome rather than two, and the demand for equal rights. We will look a lot more like violent South Africa before the two sides eventually decided to sit down at the negotiating table. Something that neither the Israeli Jews nor the Palestinians right now, the majority of Israeli Jews or the majority of Palestinians want. But as the one-state reality becomes the only outcome in front of us, and the two-state solution is completely destroyed, you're not going to be able to blame the two sides from wanting to come to terms with this reality that has emerged. And there will be a need to come to some sort of a solution, without which this civil war you're talking about will indeed be the main thing that will characterize Israeli-Palestinian relations.
I concur with Khalil. I have a different set of arguments for that. We have 15 million people, close to 15 million, 1/5, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. They are divided half and half. Half of them are Jews and half of them are not Jews, Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, Israeli-Arabs, also considering themselves as Palestinians. These are not minorities. So a state of civil war between those two distinct communities is something that any historian would subscribe to. So the two-state solution is, in my opinion, is not a fantasy. It is an imperative for the two people, and this is why I recommend starting to move on the ground to delineating a provisional boundary between the area in which Palestinians live, most of the Palestinians live, which is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the area in which most of the Israelis live, which is the large blocks of settlements adjacent to the 1967 lines, and of course in Israel proper. And if we do not separate the one from the other, then we are bound to live in a continuous, perpetual circle of violence that would only end when we get back to our senses and bring back the partition of the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea into two distinct nation states with a border between them.
And on that note, I thank you all for coming. This was a very good discussion. Please thank our two participants, Gilead, Khalil. Thank you very, very much. But above all, thank all of you.
Thank you.